July 27, 1993. A new album hits record stores across America. The cover shows two young girls in angel costumes staring straight ahead with haunting innocence. Inside is music that doesn't sound like anything else on alternative radio. Massive walls of guitars layered 40 times over, drums that swing between jazz finesse and sledgehammer power, and a voice that whines and soars and confesses in equal measure. The artist is the Smashing Pumpkins. The album is Siamese Dream. And by the time you finish reading the liner notes, you realize something. This record nearly didn't exist at all. The drummer was disappearing for days on heroin binges. The guitarist and bassist had just broken up and could barely stand to be in the same room. The frontman was suicidal, sleeping in a parking garage and fantasizing about his own funeral. The label was running out of patience as the budget ballooned $250,000 over its limit. But somehow, impossibly, they created one of the greatest alternative rock albums ever made. Within 1 week of its release, Siamese Dream debuted at number 10 on the Billboard 200. It would go on to sell over 6 million copies worldwide. It earned 2 Grammy nominations. Rolling Stone would rank it among the 500 greatest albums of all time. This is the story of how Billy Corgan's obsessive pursuit of sonic perfection collided with heroin addiction, romantic breakups, nervous breakdowns, and record label pressure, and produced an album that defined a generation. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is the Smashing Pumpkins. To understand Siamese Dream, you have to go back to 1991. The Smashing Pumpkins, Billy Corgan on vocals and guitar, James Iha on guitar, Darcy Retzky on bass, and Jimmy Chamberlin on drums, had just released their debut album Gish on the independent label Caroline Records. The album was unexpected success, selling over 300,000 copies and earning critical acclaim for its blend of psychedelic shoegaze and heavy metal thunder. The Chicago band seemed poised for greatness. Then, 4 months after Gish was released, everything changed. September 24, 1991. Nirvana's Nevermind drops and detonates like a cultural bomb. Within weeks, grunge has taken over MTV. Within months, Kurt Cobain is on the cover of Rolling Stone. The alternative rock underground has exploded into the mainstream, and suddenly every label is looking for the next Nirvana. The Smashing Pumpkins were immediately tagged with that label. Same producer. Butch Vig had helmed both Gish and Nevermind. Same alternative rock pedigree. Same generation. But Billy Corgan didn't feel like a success story. He felt like he'd been left behind. "We were on tour, selling out everywhere we go," Corgan told Rolling Stone years later. "Everything went cool, fine, dandy. Suddenly, boom, Nirvana. We went from being seen as future stars almost to has-beens, people saying, 'Well, if you were so good, this would have happened to you.'" The Smashing Pumpkins were signed to Virgin Records, Caroline's parent label. Virgin wanted a follow-up album. They wanted hits. They wanted their own "Smells Like Teen Spirit." The pressure was crushing. What affected Siamese Dream was the feeling that you'd better sell a lot of records. Corgan explained to Uncut in 2014. "Because you were facing a world with indie bands selling 10 million copies. If you didn't approximate those numbers, you were facing oblivion. I've never felt pressure like that in my life." For a frontman who already struggled with depression and self-doubt, the sudden expectation to compete with Nirvana's success was devastating. Corgan's response was to retreat inward, to isolate himself, to spiral. "I lost the ability to function," he admitted to Blender magazine. "I didn't want to go outside. I was eating like a pig and gaining weight. I couldn't write songs." The songwriter who had crafted the psychedelic epics of Gish was now battling the worst writer's block of his life. Months passed, 7-8 months of nothing. Meanwhile, the personal dynamics within the band were imploding. While Corgan was spiraling into depression, the rest of the band was dealing with their own crises. James Iha and Darcy Retzky had been dating since 1988, practically since the band's formation. But during the grueling tour behind Gish, their relationship deteriorated. By 1992, they had broken up. The breakup was messy, painful, and unavoidable, because they still had to play together every night. Before and during the recording of Siamese Dream, and during the writing process, things were kind of fucked up. Retzky bluntly summarized years later. "I think we weren't mature enough not to take it out on each other." Then there was Jimmy Chamberlin. Chamberlin was, by all accounts, a drumming virtuoso. Trained in jazz from age 9, he could play with the technical precision of Buddy Rich and the raw power of John Bonham. His drumming on Gish had been a revelation, complex, dynamic, thunderous. But during the tour supporting Gish, Chamberlin developed a heroin addiction. By the time the band started working on their second album, his drug use had become a serious problem. Within 24 hours, producer Butch Vig later recalled, Jimmy knew every drug dealer, hooker, bookie, and nutcase in Atlanta. Chamberlin would disappear for days at a time, leaving the band not knowing if he was alive or dead. His addiction was no secret. It was an open wound that everyone could see but nobody could fix. And presiding over all of this chaos was Billy Corgan, who was having his own breakdown. Corgan's depression had reached its nadir. He was homeless, sleeping on Darcy's floor at one point, living in a parking garage for a while. His relationship with his girlfriend Chris Fabian had fallen apart. He was gaining weight, he was isolated, he was suicidal. I started thinking what my funeral would be like and what music would be played, Corgan confessed to NME. I was at that level of insanity. He began seeing a therapist. And slowly, through therapy, something shifted. The depression didn't disappear. But Corgan began channeling it into songwriting. He started writing again. Songs that were raw, confessional, emotionally explicit in ways that Gish had never been. The first song he wrote for the new album was called Today. Corgan played the self-recorded demo for Butch Vig, who had agreed to return as producer. Vig's reaction was immediate and positive. Here was a song with a bouncy, almost upbeat melody. But the lyrics were about a day when Corgan felt so depressed and disconnected that suicide seemed like the only option. I just thought it was funny to write a song that said, "Today is the greatest day of your life because it can't get any worse," Corgan explained. Virgin Records executives heard the demo and were pleased. But Corgan felt only more pressure. The clock was ticking. The label wanted an album. The band was barely speaking. His drummer was on heroin. His bassist and guitarist weren't talking. And Billy Corgan had to somehow create a masterpiece. December 1992. The Smashing Pumpkins relocate from Chicago to Marietta, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta. They're going to record at Triclops Sound Studios, a small facility far from the distractions of home. The decision to record in Georgia is strategic. They need to escape the Chicago scene. They need to cut Chamberlin off from his known drug connections. They need isolation. Butch Vig reprises his role as producer. But this time, Vig knows it won't be like Gish. This time, Billy Corgan has a vision, an ambitious, almost impossibly detailed vision of exactly how this album should sound. Billy and I raised the bar really high, Vig told PSN Europe. We wanted to make a very ambitious sounding record. It was all done on analog tape, so it was time-consuming. We were working 12 hours a day, 6 times a week for about 3 months, and for the last 2 months we worked 7 days a week, 14 or 15 hours a day because we were behind schedule. Corgan's vision was to create sonic depth without relying on typical production tricks like reverb and delay. Instead, he wanted to layer guitars, dozens and dozens of guitar tracks, to create a massive, enveloping wall of sound. Billy wanted to make a record that people would put on and say, "What the fuck was that?" Vig explained. We wanted to have things going on in the left ear and right ear all the time. The song Soma, co-written by James Iha, would eventually contain up to 40 overdubbed guitar parts. Vig stated that some songs had as many as 100 guitar tracks compressed into a single mix. This was painstaking work. All recorded on analog tape. No Pro Tools shortcuts. Corgan and Vig would sometimes spend 2 full days working on a 45-second section of music, trying to achieve the exact sonic texture Corgan heard in his head. Corgan essentially lived in the studio. He had nowhere else to go. He was still essentially homeless. He slept there, ate there, obsessed there. Billy was a mad scientist with the guitars, Vig told Tape-Up. A lot of times I would have to draw out a map, literally, of the song for his guitars with all these arrows, going, okay, this one goes to track 14 for the clean guitar through the second verse. For instance, on Soma, that was one of the biggest guitar maps I ever had. That was epic. But Corgan's perfectionism came at a cost. As the recording sessions progressed, Billy Corgan made a decision that would define both the album and the band's fractured relationships. He started re-recording the guitar and bass parts that James Iha and Darcy Retzky had laid down. Not some of them. Most of them. Darcy would record a bass part. Corgan would thank her, then stay late and re-record it himself. James would lay down guitar tracks. Corgan would overdub them with his own playing. By the end of the sessions, the only band member whose performances remained entirely untouched was Jimmy Chamberlin, and only because Chamberlin's drumming was so extraordinary that even Corgan couldn't replicate it. Engineer Jeff Tomei offers a practical explanation. My opinion as to why is that Billy knew pretty much what he wanted. In all fairness to James and Darcy, there is no way to get inside someone else's head and play exactly what they envision. I also don't think that they were as prepared for the record as Billy. Darcy Retzky later confirmed this reasoning, stating that Corgan re-recorded their parts because he could lay them down in recording easier and with far fewer takes. But the effect on band morale was devastating. Darcy would lock herself in the bathroom, James wouldn't say anything, or Billy would lock himself in the control room, Vig recalled. The studio became a battlefield. Nobody was happy. Everyone felt undermined. But the music kept getting better. Corgan later admitted there was truth to accusations of tyrannical behavior, though he felt the press misunderstood the situation. Musicianship and technical vision are fine and good, he told Rolling Stone, but at some point you cross a line. No matter how good an album you've got away the gut of your band. Meanwhile, Jimmy Chamberlin's heroin addiction was spiraling out of control. Despite the plan to isolate Chamberlin from his drug connections, the drummer managed to find heroin in Atlanta almost immediately. He would disappear for 2 or 3 days at a time, leaving the band in terror that he'd overdosed somewhere. Producer Butch Vig remembers the chaos. From day one, Jimmy Chamberlin was in trouble with drug dealers and crazy people who he met in clubs and on the street, who he would invite into the studios. The situation came to a head during the recording of Cherub Rock, the album's opening track. After Chamberlin had disappeared for several days, Corgan put the hammer down, according to Vig. When Chamberlin finally returned, Corgan demanded that he play the drum part for Cherub Rock over and over and over, until his hands were bleeding. It was brutal. It was arguably abusive. But it was also Corgan's desperate attempt to salvage the record and shock Chamberlin into recognizing the severity of his addiction. Due to Corgan's urging, Chamberlin eventually checked into a rehab clinic during a break in the sessions. Corgan later told Spin magazine, "You know, I gave them a year and a half to prepare for this record. I'm surrounded by these people who I care about very much, yet they continue to keep failing me." He explained that he began to take others' actions personally. If you really think about it, of course, someone doesn't do the job because they're lazy or they don't think it's important. But I took it as, you're not worth going home and working on the song. The irony is that while Corgan was demanding perfection from everyone around him, he was also battling his own demons. Throughout the entire recording process, he was planning his own suicide. He would later admit in 2011 that during the making of Siamese Dream, he had been seriously contemplating taking his own life. He was giving away possessions, planning his funeral, fantasizing about what music would be played. The album that would eventually be called a masterpiece was being created by people who were barely holding themselves together. Despite, or perhaps because of, all the chaos, remarkable songs were emerging. Cherub Rock, which Corgan later confessed was ripped off from Rush, became a scathing attack on the alternative music industry. The lyrics targeted the indie rock gatekeepers who had dismissed the Pumpkins as sellouts. Who wants honey as long as there's some money? It was a middle finger to everyone who said they weren't punk enough, weren't authentic enough, weren't alternative enough. Today paired its bouncy, almost cheerful melody with lyrics about suicidal depression. The contrast was jarring, intentional, and brilliant. Corgan saw dark humor in writing a song that said, "Today is the greatest day," when you literally can't imagine things getting worse. Disarm was an acoustic ballad framed by church bells, timpani, and orchestral strings. It drew from Corgan's complicated relationship with his parents and his troubled childhood. The song was so emotionally raw that Corgan later compared writing it to "ripping my guts out." The BBC would ban the song in the UK because of lines like, "cut that little child." But radio bands couldn't stop Disarm from becoming one of the band's biggest international hits, reaching number 11 on the UK charts. Spaceboy was written as a tribute to Corgan's half-brother Jesse, who had special needs. Geek USA was a reworked version of an earlier song called Suicide Kiss, featuring some of Chamberlin's most impressive drumming. Rocket moved from jangly REM-style guitars to shoegazing bliss. And then there was Mayonnaise, a song that would become a fan favorite despite never being released as a single during the album's initial run. It perfectly embodied the album's aesthetic. Quiet verses that exploded into walls of distorted guitars, introspective lyrics about emotional isolation, and production so layered and dense you could listen 100 times and still hear new details. Most of Corgan's lyrics for Siamese Dream were about his girlfriend and future wife Chris Fabian, with whom he had briefly broken up while writing the songs. The album is, in many ways, a document of romantic heartbreak, clinical depression, and the slow process of putting yourself back together. The music sounded nothing like Nirvana. It sounded nothing like the grunge that was dominating alternative radio. According to Rolling Stone, the album was closer to progressive rock than to punk or grunge, which is exactly what Corgan wanted. He didn't want to be the next Nirvana. He wanted to be the first Smashing Pumpkins. By March 1993, the recording sessions were finally complete. The album had taken 4 months to record. 4 months of 12 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week toward the end. Virgin Records was growing impatient. The album was 4 months behind schedule and $250,000 over budget. The label wanted it finished, they wanted it mixed, they wanted it released. But by the time recording wrapped, Corgan and Vig were emotionally and physically exhausted. They'd been locked in that studio, obsessing over every guitar tone and drum fill for so long that they no longer trusted their own ears. Corgan made a decision. They needed a fresh set of ears to mix the album. He suggested Alan Moulder, the British engineer who had mixed My Bloody Valentine's legendary shoegaze album, Loveless. Moulder was known for creating massive, enveloping soundscapes, exactly what Siamese Dream needed. Moulder booked 2 weeks at Rumbo Recorders in Canoga Park, California, to mix the album. The mix took 36 days. Moulder worked meticulously, trying to balance the dozens of guitar tracks, the jazz-influenced drums, the vocals, the strings on Disarm, the mellotron on Spaceboy. He had to create clarity without losing the wall of sound density that Corgan and Vig had labored so hard to achieve. The final result was a production masterpiece, a record that sounded ornate and ambitious compared to the deliberately raw aesthetic of most early 90s alternative rock. It had the sonic depth Corgan had obsessed over, created not through reverb and delay but through layering and tonality. When the album was finally finished, it had cost approximately $250,000 over its original budget. Virgin Records was not happy about the cost overruns, but they couldn't argue with the music. The album was scheduled for release in late July 1993. All that remained was for the world to hear it. The artwork for Siamese Dream has its own strange story. The album was originally going to feature artwork created by an outsider artist, but after disagreements with the label, Corgan was forced to step in at the last minute. The cover photo, 2 young girls in angel costumes, their faces serene but somehow unsettling, was shot by photographer Melody McDaniel. The girls were child models named Ali Langer and Lysandra Roberts, based in California. Ali Langer later described the shoot as the ultimate childhood dream day. We ate lemon heads and enjoyed rocket popsicles from the ice cream truck that happened to pass by during the shoot, all while being dressed up in a cute dress with angel wings. Of course, any 7-year-old would love that. For years, the identity of the girls was unknown. In 2007, after the Pumpkins reformed, Corgan posted a message saying they were looking for girls from Siamese Dream album cover. As you all know, they were quite young when the photo was taken. They are not conjoined anymore as far as we know. In 2011, Corgan announced via Twitter that one of the girls had been found, and she was the band's current bassist, Nicole Fiorentino. This turned out to be false. The girls were actually located in 2008, and in 2018, Corgan posted a photo with them on Instagram, now grown women, thanking them for being part of the album. The album booklet was assembled by Corgan and his wife Chris Fabian the day after their wedding. It featured old photographs of both strangers and Corgan's family members, with handwritten lyrics overlaid. Corgan later admitted he wasn't satisfied with the results, but the DIY aesthetic fit the album's raw emotional honesty. The first pressing of the CD contained a 20-page booklet with a separate page devoted to each song's lyrics and accompanying photograph. Later pressings reduced this to a 4-panel fold-out. Everything about the album's presentation reinforced its themes: innocence and darkness, beauty and pain, the personal made universal. July 27, 1993. Siamese Dream is released in the United States. The following week, it debuts at number 10 on the Billboard 200. The album is almost universally lauded by music critics. Entertainment Weekly's David Brown praises the band for living up to industry expectations of being the next Nirvana and compares Siamese Dream favorably to Nirvana's Nevermind, concluding, "In aiming for more than just another alternative guitar record, Smashing Pumpkins may have stumbled upon a whole new stance, slackers with a vision." Select Magazine declares it the most grand-scale, expansively passionate blasts of music you'll hear this year. NME calls it a startling, deeply satisfying record. Not everyone is convinced. Critic Simon Reynolds writes in the New York Times that fuzzed-up riffs and angst-racked vocals are quite the norm these days, and Smashing Pumpkins lacks the zeitgeist-defining edge that made Nirvana's breakthrough so thrilling and resonant. But the commercial response is undeniable. Cherub Rock becomes a rock radio staple. Today brings the band mainstream popularity through wide radio airplay and a memorable music video directed by Stefan Sednawi, featuring the band riding in a painted ice cream truck. Disarm peaks at number 11 on the UK singles chart despite being banned by the BBC. Rocket becomes the 4th single. By November 1993, the album is certified platinum. By 1996, it's certified 4X platinum in the United States. Worldwide sales eventually exceed 6 million copies. In January 1994, the Grammy nominations are announced. Siamese Dream receives 2 nominations. Best Alternative Music Album and Best Hard Rock Performance with Vocal for Cherub Rock. The Smashing Pumpkins have arrived. The album that nearly destroyed them has instead made them superstars. Chicago Tribune critic Greg Kot would later write that Siamese Dream became a soundtrack for a significant portion of Corgan's generation, and did so by tempering some of the first album's extremes. Sticky melodies and pretty production can make almost anything radio-friendly, even a desperately sad song like Today. Success didn't cure the band's problems. Jimmy Chamberlin's heroin addiction continued to worsen. His father died in 1995 during the Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness tour, and Chamberlin's drug use spiraled completely out of control. In July 1996, touring keyboardist Jonathan Melvoin overdosed and died in a New York hotel room after shooting heroin with Chamberlin. Chamberlin was arrested for drug possession. Billy Corgan had no choice but to fire his drummer. Drugs have never been a part of the band's personality or reputation, Craig Marks, who wrote a spin cover story about the band, observed. Their internal conflicts have had more to do with ego, not drugs. Darcy Retzky's relationship with Corgan continued deteriorating for years. She would eventually leave the band in 1999, severing ties completely. The Smashing Pumpkins would release one more masterpiece, 1995's ambitious double album, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, which debuted at #1 and sold even more copies than Siamese Dream. But the band that created it was slowly coming apart. Despite all the turmoil, Corgan has consistently called Siamese Dream his favorite Smashing Pumpkins album. Even though it wasn't the one that sold the most, it's the one that seems to have come through the best, the singer said. As dark a record as Siamese Dream is, there's a lot of fun in it. It's almost like we're kind of laughing at how stupid the whole thing is. More than 30 years after its release, Siamese Dream is widely regarded as one of the greatest alternative rock albums ever made. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked it number 360 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. The ranking has remained consistent through multiple updates of the list. Alternative Press ranked it the fourth best album of the 1990s. Pitchfork ranked it 18th. Spin ranked it 23rd. In April 2019, Rolling Stone ranked Siamese Dream as the 12th greatest grunge album of all time, despite the fact that it sounds nothing like grunge. AllMusic's retrospective review called it one of the finest alt-rock albums of all time, and remarked that it stands alongside Nevermind and Superunknown as one of the decade's finest and most influential rock albums. The album has been included in the book 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. The influence of Siamese Dream can be heard in countless bands that followed. My Chemical Romance, Deftones, and Silversun Pickups all drew from its template of combining melodic sensitivity with crushing heaviness. The album proved that alternative rock could be ambitious, ornate, and emotionally complex without losing its edge. What makes Siamese Dream endure is its honesty. This is an album about depression, addiction, heartbreak, and the desperate need to create something beautiful out of pain. You can hear the struggle in every overdubbed guitar track, every whispered verse that explodes into a wall of distortion, every lyric that admits vulnerability. Billy Corgan once said the album was their way of saying, "This is us, we're here to kick your door down." That defiant spirit, the refusal to sound like anyone else, to bow to indie rock gatekeepers, to make anything safe, is what makes Siamese Dream special. The album captured the moment when grunge was starting to wane and alternative rock was searching for new directions. It filled that void with progressive rock ambition, shoegaze textures, metal heaviness, and pop melody, all filtered through one man's obsessive pursuit of sonic perfection. In 2023, the Smashing Pumpkins released Mayonnaise as the album's fifth single, 30 years after the album's original release, introducing the song to a new generation. The story of Siamese Dream is ultimately about what it costs to create art. It cost Billy Corgan his mental health, at least temporarily. It cost him friendships and band relationships. It cost the label $250,000 over budget. It cost Jimmy Chamberlin his spot in the band after Jonathan Melvoin's death. It cost Darcy Retzky and James Iha their sense of creative ownership. But it gave the world one of the most sonically ambitious, emotionally honest, and influential rock albums of the 1990s. When you listen to Siamese Dream today, when you hear that opening drum roll on Cherub Rock and the massive guitar wall that follows, you're hearing the sound of four people at the absolute edge of what they could endure. You're hearing depression channeled into melody, addiction battled through drum takes, perfectionism taken to its breaking point. You're hearing an album that, by all logic, should never have been completed. And yet here it is, over 30 years later, still sounding like nothing else. That 8-month pregnant woman lying on the studio floor in Lauryn Hill's story never met the band sleeping in parking garages and bathrooms in Georgia. but they share something fundamental: the willingness to sacrifice everything for the music. Siamese Dream won 2 Grammy nominations. It sold 6 million copies. It changed alternative rock. And it nearly killed everyone who made it. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories, like the Pumpkins, leave blood on the drum kit.